these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, everybody. A few weeks ago, we had a task force to combat Mexican drug cartels meeting, as we do every week. And we always have a special guest with us. And those guests have ranged from officials at Homeland Security, DEA, FBI, local law enforcement, ex Mexican police officers. We've had Bill Barr, former Attorney General, speak to our task force. We're the president of Ecuador at some point. So I haven't been following some of the podcasts that we've put out with those guests. You should. This guest is really good, and you're going to want to listen to this one. So today we have Ioan Grillo. Ioan Grillo spoke to the task force a few weeks back. And he's a journalist who's worked in South America since 2001. He's worked at the New York Times, France 24, National Geographic, author of 3 books, El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency from 2011. He's author of Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America, and Blood, Gun, Money. That's a lot of interesting things all in one title. Bloods and Gun and Money. How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. So I've been writing about this for, a long time. But the Mexican cartels haven't really captured the imagination of the American public until recent years. And that's largely due to the fentanyl crisis, where, we're seeing actual deaths and they're directly related to cartel activity. So, Ioan, it was great to have you. It was great to hear from you. So we want to recap for the listeners some of the things we talked about at that meeting with members of Congress. I think we'll start with some of the main features of cartel activity that you've seen evolve over the last 20 years. You mentioned 3, paramilitary, organized crime, looking more like a military, moving into a more diversified portfolio from just drugs, and then also that corrupt cartel government relationship. I'll leave it there, but you tell us about the 20-year trend.
Yeah, sure thing. So I arrived in Mexico in 2000 and began reporting in 2001 at the kind of moment in Mexico where there was big hopes of a change to democracy in this kind of big wave of democratic change throughout the world. But then you had this issue of cartels, of organized crime violence, which was kind of rumbling in the background and rose and continues to be one of the top, if not the top issue for this country. Now, when in 2004, I was working for the Houston Chronicle out of Houston, Texas, and I was sent there to report on a turf war happening on the border with Texas in the Mexican city of Nuevo Laredo, over from Laredo, Texas. Kind of a local Texas story in some ways. But this, in some ways, was the beginning of the new type of violence that will go across Mexico. So there, you'd had back in the 90s this violence, and sometimes you had gang members who were recruited from the United States, people recruited from San Diego, from the Logan Heights gang, tattooed gang members with shaved heads, firing pistols. But this, you saw a real marked change in Nuevo Laredo. You saw the entrance of the Zetas. Now, the Zetas were a group who recruited from the Mexican military, and some of them underwent training with the United States, which gets into some of the big issues I think, we're discussing and you've been focusing on. So they actually had some U.S. training, some they found training in the United States or training in Mexico from U.S. personnel. And they defected from the Mexican army to join this Gulf cartel. The head of it at the time, Osel Cardenas, said, I want real soldiers. I want the best fighters. And they said, we can get them from the Mexican military. So they got them. Now, the Sinaloa cartel was fighting the Zetas to try and control this border city. And they sent in gang members and the Zetas who were like bulletproof vests, metal helmets, rifles, just took these guys out and piled up their bodies and sent notes saying, send us more idiots like these. These are a stronger word, and we'll kill them. Now, there's also coincided another big theme, I think, understand it's also coincided with the lifting of the assault rifle ban in 2004. And I know this is complexities around the actual issue of definitions of assault rifles and so forth, but there was easier access to AK-47s, AR-15s. And we saw this moment, a big wave of those coming over the border and being used by this organization. Now, I didn't realize at the time I was covering this at the time. It was, it was scary. It was exciting. But this really was the tip of something which would change Mexico and change the violence in Mexico. Because once you had a move from gang violence to paramilitary organized crime violence, then that spread across Mexico. Everybody was like, we've got to get some of these guys, including, and I had strong evidence of this, some active US military being recruited and coming over to join these. So this was really this raising, then I began to cover this around the country over the years, started to see this death toll go up to the hundreds of thousands, quite literally. And then also this move of these organized crime groups, paramilitary organized crime, taking over large sectors of society.
Yeah. And how much of Mexican society would you say is maybe, I don't even know if control is the right word, but integrated into the cartel organization? It depends on the state that you're in, but I mean, some states, would you say, are just completely integrated into cartel activity?
Again, that's a great question. I think, again, for understanding Mexico and the current situation and why some of the ideas or the hopes that this could be solved easily through the military. I know we discussed that your proposal for the military was different than some people were portraying this, but this idea of how military could contain this is very, very different. And sometimes the language we use is hard to understand the way that cartels operate. So if we, I think to discuss like a percentage of the country occupied by cartels doesn't really work in that same sense, because you can get these areas, you can get towns where the cartel is extremely present, but the Mexican state is present as well. So it's not like when the Islamic State gained territory in a country and they pushed out the whole government, and they were interested in things like running schools because they wanted Islamic education, or the
Mhm.
shining path in Peru going back to the 1990s, 1980s, the shining path in Peru, this idea they want to control and reform people, control education. The cartels don't care about, they're happy that teachers come in and give lessons in schools. They're happy the government is there and providing electricity, but they control aspects of these territories. So they want to control all aspects of organized crime. Now they've broadened that from simply trafficking drugs, making sure they're making money from anybody trafficking drugs or directly doing it themselves, selling drugs locally, but also other businesses, including human smuggling, which is undocumented migrants coming through and taking money from these smuggling groups, taking over the theft of oil, which has at times been a huge business worth in the billions of dollars, directly stealing oil from the Mexican state oil industry, wildcat mining, and taking over mines, silver mines, and a
Yeah.
range of activities. So you have this parallel duopoly of power. Now it varies where you see it. Sometimes you see these villages where you go in there and you see very clearly, armed guys with AK-47s guarding, people in barricades, civilian groups working with the cartels. But in other places, they're much more hidden. They're acting more like an urban guerrilla in military terms, or like a kind of hidden force. You go around the town, it looks normal, but they're there. And another added problem is when the Mexican military comes into these places, they can hide. And then when it goes away, they can come out again.
So we didn't talk a lot about the oil connection here. And I think that's interesting, especially since I just found out that, wow, why am I blanking on his name? The creator of Yellowstone, Taylor Sheridan. I just found out, I don't know if it's public knowledge, but I guess I just made it public knowledge. He's they're in the process of filming a new show, and it's all about cartels and oil, and it's in Texas, and so that's not something people talk about a whole lot. So Walk us through that. They steal oil. How do they steal oil? Are they literally tapping pipelines? And then
Yeah, yeah.
how do they actually get into the market for selling oil? I mean, how does this work? And is there like a U.S. nexus to this?
Absolutely, yeah. So this has been there's a tradition kind of going back before the rise of cartels. And when we talk about cartels, I mean, it's kind of a short term. We can get into the kind of really the idea of what it is, but really this kind of network of these modern organized crime forces that are complicated forces and often not totally centralized companies. But anyway, this goes back before the kind of modern last 15 years rise of cartels, and they call it in Spanish they call them huachicoleros, and called the stolen oil huachicol. So this is going back for some time, as long as Mexico's had an oil industry on some kind of smaller scale. The cartels took over this and expanded it. Now, in many cases, they will literally tap the pipeline. Now, you'll sometimes see one tap pulling the oil out. I mean, drilling a hole in the pipeline and sucking the oil out. Then someone's do a second hole to put something else in to try and stabilize the pressure.
Mm.
Now, so you have some people with knowledge, sometimes former oil workers involved in this. They'll do this. There's been times when they'll be tapping a pipe and it will go up and explode. And there's been various cases you can see of that
Yeah.
happening, and fireballs, and whole neighborhoods go up in flames and people dying with this issue. Now they're taking this oil out and they use it for different things. Sometimes you see, and I've been to these places where there's literally selling huachicol, stolen oil in kind of alternative gas stations. Not as cheap as you may think. Sometimes it's things like a third of the price at the pump, but that's still a third off, and people, everyone wants to save money. Other times, though, there's been cases.
How do they
and there's a
refine
document-
it? How do they refine the oil? Like, you can't just
So
sell oil.
sometimes sometimes they're taking refined oil.
Okay.
Other
They're stealing
other
gas.
time,
Yeah.
other times they'll take oil and they'll use it for things like brick making, like burning in more
Okay.
kind of industrial
Right.
trades.
Right.
But
Stealing the raw
also,
product.
there's cases where they've stolen oil and taken it to the United States and actually sold it through brokers in Houston. And
Hmm.
you saw networks, these kind of crime networks doing this, the Zetas doing this. You can see some documented cases, and some of this came out as well at a trial in Austin in around 2012.
Wow. That's fascinating. And is that still a big business for them?
He's now the current president, Andres Manuel López Obrador. One of his big campaigns was actually to go after huachicoleros, to go after this.
Hmm.
Particularly him being from an oil state of Tabasco, him
Yeah.
seeing oil is very important to the Mexican economy, a bit of an oil nationalist, building a new oil refinery here. But he also has made more of an effort to go after the cartels on this. And initially at least had some success. There's some reports, and it's a bit mixed if it's now crept back, but it's still definitely a business for them.
Where are you based out of?
Mexico City.
You're in Mexico City. Okay. Where our task force will be down there. I think, as you know, mid-February, be great to hear from you again there. And help guide us through this complicated mess, because it's you bring an interesting perspective. And one of the questions I have is, how do you actually get your information? It's because it's a different outlook than, I get government briefings and we have ways of getting that information. But for a journalist, I mean, do you go in bed with cartels? Do you go talk to them? I mean, how do you request a meeting with a cartel sicario? Do you send them an email? Does he have like a Facebook profile? Like, how does this work?
Yeah, sure. So, over 23 years of covering this has been all kinds of sources. So obviously there's the government sources, there's the politicians, there's the police officers. Now, often in Mexico, it can be easier sometimes getting police officers, getting prosecutors, getting military in the field, on the ground there. I have been also where you request ride-alongs and go on a military helicopter and so forth. But often it's in the field where they start to give things away. In terms of covering cartels, and if I may mention, I have a newsletter with some of this stuff you can find called Crash Out Media. And you
Yeah.
can see interviews that we have with some active or former cartel people, also along with some colleagues also doing this, and many have done it over the years. These can be in different circumstances. It can sometimes be in prisons or with prisoners by telephones
Mm.
in both the United States, Mexico, and other countries. I mean, there's a lot of prisoners in the United States who are doing long sentences, and you are able to talk, so you can talk to people in prison. There's also people who have been in prison and left prison and have interested to talk to journalists. And there are active people in the field, and it's no secret that many journalists have done that. You can find many videos the journalists have done with cartels and cartels doing these things. Now, this varies. In some places, there's many different ways that contact can be found with cartels. In some places, particularly small towns, they're a form of alternative authority. So they're actually like, for people who live there, they're kind of almost like the police force. An example of this and how this works, when you saw the massacre of 9 American women and children in Sonora, Mexico in 2019, there was the first people to go to the mountains in response to that with a local group of like sicarios, cartel people responding to that. So you kind of see that you can find ways there. And then obviously when reporting the stuff with cartel, people, sometimes you can say, well, this is what the source is saying. We have to report this to kind of understand this. But obviously, sometimes we've got to take it with a pinch of salt. But then that also goes the same for military sources and police officers and politicians on both sides.
Have you ever felt like you got out over your skis and you got your, looking for the right source, and you got into a situation you wish you weren't in?
So there was a time going back to 2014, and there was an interesting situation in the state of Michoacan, which was an uprising basically of self-defense squads, vigilantes, against the cartel. The cartel got very predatory, very abusive, and the cartel was not only moving drugs and taking over mines, but it was extorting, shaking everybody down. Avocado growers, lime growers, all of these people. And also there was a lot of, accusations of quite a wide scale rape of women as well. So there, people rose up with guns, and they began quite small and became a force of, more than 10,000 people fighting the cartel. It seemed like a good end to the story, the cartel being defeated. And covering this was quite we could ride around with these self-defense groups and so forth. Later on in the conflict, this force became very infiltrated by drug traffickers themselves. And later on, this is towards the end of this conflict, when most of the kind of big fighting kind of died down. I was there. I've been covering it right through, but this is, I carried on covering it, right through to the end, and arrived with a group of about 50 guys preparing to go on a mission to try and hunt down a drug trafficker called La Tuta. Now, when I talked to them, I realized very quickly these were not regular self-defense forces, but these were drug cartel guys, and they had these, they had grenades strapped around their chests and ammo belts strapped around their chests, and I was taking photographs. They were posing for photographs, and then one of them accused me of being a DEA agent, became suddenly very aggressive and said, "This is a DEA agent." And I said, well, I'm British. I'm not even American. Here's my webpage and so forth. And the guy calmed a bit. He said, if I see you again, I'm going to put a bullet in your head. I'm going to throw a grenade at you. And I left, and the guys went off and got in a big gunfight. And I was actually more annoyed with myself at the time for not being with them to film this encounter, and kind of miss the journalistic opportunity. But later on, kind of realized, okay, it was maybe better not to be there.
Yeah. Bullets in the head. They're very difficult to recover from, especially if he also puts a grenade in you. That seems like an odd threat. Like it's an odd secondary threat.
Yeah.
Put the bullet in your head, and then I'm going to put a grenade. I mean, what's the point of the grenade at that point? But that sounds. What year was that?
Now that was going back to 2014.
Yeah, and like I said, it's crazy how long this has been going on. So there's been different strategies tried here. Vicente Fox, promised like a kind of an all-out war against the cartels, and there was quite an escalation and violence. I mean, of course, the recent administration of AMLO has taken a very different stance. In the last couple of administrations, you might say, what will work? I mean, if the goal is, let's be reasonable here, diminished power of the cartels, diminished control over Mexican society, diminished profits, just overall dismantling. There's no silver bullet, but I mean, what things have we tried that we could have done better at? Haven't tried, in all of your experience, what would you think?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, sometimes it's, one thing is come up with the ideas, but really how, both Mexico and the United States can try and grapple with this issue. I mean, you've already mentioned fentanyl, and why we end up talking about this is really the fentanyl deaths in the United States, which is a real severe issue, as well. I think various things. I think we could say maybe put this into three different areas. One area is with the drugs themselves, and how can there really be? It's a double tragedy that when you have this many drug users in the United States, and people dying of drugs, the double tragedy that people are suffering and dying from the drugs, and the money they're spending is funding this violence here. So on one side, how can you reduce that huge amount of money going to the cartels? I mean, and find out how much money this really is. Both, I think, with on the US side, with policing on the US side, and really working with the addiction. A second category is in terms of Mexico, and I guess this is something for good Mexican organizations to do, and there are people out there, but people who are can really try and save the young people from being recruited by the cartels. And I've done a lot of tracking of life stories, of interviewing people, and I've been to youth prisons, and you talk to kids who are recruited at 12 years old into these cartels, so kind of child soldiers, and they're recruited first to be lookouts, and then they start committing murders, and then series of murders at a young age. So how can you have really focused social work to try and help crime prevention, from being in these organizations, and say some of these places where the cartel is like the local power, where really they're like, people look up to power, and for young kids, and an aggressive young kid, like in some neighborhoods in the US, people
Yeah.
might say, well, I'm going to join the military.
It's the same conversation about gangs. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to join the cartel. I mean, they're seen as the power. So how can you direct that social work? And the third thing is, how can you have really effective law enforcement in Mexico, or support Mexico to build effective law enforcement? That's a huge challenge. But there are also some other things as well. I guess in the short term, it's like basic controls and basic pushing this back, maybe some basic strategy, put on this control of roads and so forth. But there isn't, this issue of firearms, I think, is something, firearms trafficking to cartels. I wrote this book about it, did a long study of 4 years about this, about the firearms trafficking from the United States to cartels in Mexico. And I think this conversation doesn't have to be about challenging the Second Amendment. It doesn't have to be about assault rifle bans. It can simply be enforcing the law and not selling firearms in this level. And examples, the concrete examples where you see where people have gone into stores and they're buying, 10 AK-47s that go for the cartels, where single straw buyers are buying, 500, spending $500,000 on 750 weapons for the cartels.
Yeah.
Basic enforcement to stop there could be something as well.
Yeah, well, they did pass additional laws on that,
Yeah.
and then one of the bills recently. I mean, the confiscations are actually through the roof. Because this is the Mexican argument. The Mexicans are like, well, you guys have all this demand, and you send us guns. And my response is, well, you have a lot of demand for guns, so it's not a really good double check. And after looking at this problem, I haven't looked at it as long as you have, but it's very difficult to change human nature. I will never change the desire for human beings to get high. That's an impossible thing to change. So that demand will always be there. Stricter law enforcement penalties on dealers, especially with fentanyl, I think are a must, because incentives matter, right? Human beings operate off incentives. We've done a lot. I've gotten briefings from Homeland Security Investigations, who's the primary actor to deal with weapons trafficking. ATF deals with the illegal straw buying. And, one of the problems we have, here's what your take is on this, is for everything I hear from our law enforcement is that when they try to do these investigations, they can't get the serial numbers from the Mexican authorities. So Mexican authorities will confiscate a bunch of weapons, and ATF will be like, all right, well, give us the serial numbers. So then we can trace that back to an FFL, licensed dealer, and they don't do it. And that's odd. So now, and the other thing I've come to realize is, U.S. based weapons are definitely a major part of the cartel inventory, but they're bigger, heavier weapons. They're major, dangerous stuff that's coming from the black market from South American militaries, as it turns out. So it's just complicated. But it is an easy thing, at least for us. I'm like, yeah, I totally agree. When the Mexican government, because when we have this conversation with them, they're like, well, you got to do something about guns. And I'm like, we are. We agree, and we are. The biggest impediment here, and the thing we struggle with on the task force, is what can we do? Because the Mexican policies are outside of our control, and they have a different operating mindset than Colombians do. Maybe talk to us about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so just to add on what you said about the weapons, I think on one side you're correct. Like grenades, for example, we had a lot of grenades coming from El Salvador. Actually, some of these were grenades that were supplied to the Salvadoran government going back to the 1980s and the civil war. They're sitting in stockpiles, being stolen in massive quantities. And so when I see these guys with grenades strapped around their chest in the field there, because they're buying these grenades very cheaply, but they're being stolen from these militaries down there. That's a problem as well. And I agree, it shouldn't be a get out clause for Mexico to say, you don't supply weapons, then everything's going to be fine. Mexico has to act for its own sake with this problem as well. So certainly. Now, in terms of you brought up the
well, I think what's interesting is I thought my question was really about I kind of changed subjects on you. And it's because it's about cooperation with the Mexican government. If you compare our relationship with Mexico to our relationship with Colombia, these are two very similar countries that in different time eras. Colombia was in this situation in the early 90s. And over the course of 30 years is in a much better place. But that came with a lot of U.S. cooperation and a mindset that was like, no, you know what? The gringos are here to help us. And that's what we're going to go with. We've had special forces unit, SEAL teams in Colombia consistently for 20, 30 years. And that in Panama, same thing. It is not the case in Mexico at all, right? They have a very different cultural mindset on even cooperating with the United States. And I thought maybe you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mexico, as part of its identity, is very proud of its sovereignty, and very proud of the idea of kind of national sovereignty, national independence. And partly, like there has a history of various foreign interventions, including by the United States, but also by France and by the other powers. So anything which kind of threatens the idea of Mexican sovereignty and the idea of defending the Mexican nation and sovereignty is generally very popular across the board in Mexico. So it can be a left wing, right wing, whatever those words really mean these days, but it can be either side. It can also still rally the idea of sovereignty, and often the kind of enemy of that sovereignty could be seen as being the United States. Now, at the same time, Mexico, on a practical level, governments consistently want to work with the United States. And you can see, again, left wing, right wing, very keen on maintaining the trade relationship with the United States and so forth. So I think in terms of diplomacy, now this is tough. You had already, going back to 2007, an increased security arrangement with Mexico and the US. that was made between George W. Bush and President Felipe Calderon. And at that time, when President Felipe Calderon was talking about, was having an increased military crackdown on cartels.
Yeah.
Now, one of the sad things about that, and it makes looking back, U.S. officials who participate in this look bad in a way, is that then you had one of the key figures in that, who was Genaro Garcia Luna, the public security secretary, and who developed a very close relationship with the U.S. officials, including CIA officials and various officials, then tried and convicted for drug trafficking. And you had crazy stuff where and I was covering this at the time, the biggest drug bust in world history of cocaine at that time, in the port of Manzanillo in 2007, where they got 23 tons of cocaine. And then you had them, this was said at the trial, they actually had criminals taking that cocaine back and putting in fake cocaine made of like flour and sugar and changing it there. So that's one of the big problems of what, actually this kind of support for Mexico can turn out being. Another issue is you have many massacres by the Mexican military, but still I think we're going to have a new administration, and the other issue is right now there isn't a clear strategy for the U.S. to support. So it's.
What do you think of the potentially new administration if it's Claudia Sheinbaum who wins?
Well, first, Claudia Sheinbaum is the strong favorite to win. And first, I don't support I don't have any political affiliation in Mexico. I'm, totally independent, and I try and judge each administration as they go, and also judge all of them have deep problems, all of the politicians that have been in the country, but also, who can be better. I'll give her the benefit of the doubt to start in office. She's going to probably win with a powerful position. It looks that way. So she's going to come in a powerful position. I think she is somebody who is pragmatic. I think she has governed, she's governed Mexico City, and there's a lot of back and forth on this, but there has been a reduction of murders in Mexico City, according to the numbers. Quite a big reduction of murders here, but governing Mexico is a way, way bigger challenge than being mayor of Mexico City. So she's going to come against very quickly a lot of the same problems that you've got corruption, right through, in a lot of corruption in security forces. You've got levels of violence, very, very, difficult levels of violence to deal with, and the pressure from the US. So I'll give her the benefit of the doubt, and hope that she can do better than the last three presidents have on this issue of security.
Yeah, I mean, like from our perspective, you have to have some path to an increased security cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. We have things they need, and we need them to ask for those things. To me, it's that simple. And I'm like, I have a lot of sympathy for your hurt feelings from the 1840s. That was a long time ago. It's just, and you need to get over it. And frankly, like I've lived in Latin America a large part of my life. It's not like I'm blind to these things. Your average Mexican does not live in that history, right? They're like, yeah, you know what? I wouldn't. Most of my Mexican friends, yeah, I wish you guys would go kill some of these cartel members. You know why? Because they just murdered 6 teenagers for no reason. I mean, that's what they do every day in Mexico. So it's they're indirectly murdering tens of thousands of Americans, but they're very directly murdering tens of thousands of Mexicans over the last 10 years. I mean, so it's, this should be a very easy thing for us to work together on, but their politics are just so odd to me. But I look at the military.
Go ahead. Had a story on that about what Mexico can ask for, or a couple of stories on that. One is I talked to Felipe Calderon when they negotiated the murder initiative, and he said that he sat there with George W. Bush, and he said to George W. Bush, "I want America to support Mexico in fighting drug cartels." And Bush was like, "Okay, what do you need?" And he said, have you seen the show, the TV show 24?
We
Which
need
was
Jack
like,
Bauer.
he said, I want all the gadgets in that show. So- and he
Not
said,
real.
that's one of the things that they gave. But you brought up about, like, I mean, look, obviously when people say, like, and there's people living in communities which are really terrorized by cartels. I was just reporting in the southern state of Mexico, southern state of Chiapas in Mexico, where there's a cartel called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel who've taken over a town. And people, I talked to a pastor at a church who said, we've been invaded here. We're being totally intimidated. It's like living under occupation of a very violent, aggressive force. So in the moment of saying, yeah, if somebody can come in there and kill these guys, we'd love that. I've seen people in these hard hit areas saying, we need Superman to come in here. We need Jesus Christ to come in here. So people, are desperate. At the same time, the actual reality of a kind of US force going in. I mean, just one thing is the size of this. I mean, you've got, these cartels, you've got, the way I see it, you have two major, massive international cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco. But then you have four regional power cartels, and then another dozen or more local cartels, but still with, can have still potentially thousands of gunmen.
Yeah.
So this is so big that even in a case like, where you have the massacre of 9 American women and children, and in that moment, if there was, you could say, well, we're going to send over a squad. We've got the location of a camp. We're going to go over there and take them out. Even if you went over there and took out, 50, 100 cartel guys, there's hundreds of thousands more. And then potential there for going in there and shooting civilians, or what that would mean in terms of creating more international issues. That's one of the reasons why I think this is
well, it's an
very tough.
insurgency war. I mean, what I argue is nobody's arguing for direct unilateral action. That's a very different story. I mean, if got desperate enough, it should be on the table. But we've been doing this for 20 years. I mean, people like me have been doing this for a long time. We have a very long history in education and insurgency warfare where we pick a side, and, that side is the Iraqi government or the Afghanistan government, or the Mexican government. And we work right alongside them. They're doing the door kicking. We're there to help. Maybe we have air support above, because they don't have that. I mean, that stood out in my trips to Mexico. That's what stood out to me the most. I mean, you guys are going down there, they're going down these very dangerous missions and don't have basic assets to support those missions, such as close air support, gunships up top, just ready to support them as they extract a cartel leader. From the military special operations perspective, it's actually not that complicated. I know it sounds that way, right? You're talking about all these thousands of people that are spread out. That's fine. That's insurgency warfare. We've done it. We know how to do it. It just takes dedication, and it takes a partner. You can't do it. It can't be the U.S. doing it. It just like moving in and do it. Of course not.
Sorry, if I may, another issue on this then, it's like, something when you see the Mexican government going in there, and just putting aside for a second, there is corruption in the Mexican security forces as well. But when the Mexican security forces actually go in, I mean, we can have incidents like, and you've seen like Culiacan 2019, if you're aware of that, was when Ovidio Guzman was detained. There was about 100 police and soldiers took him. Very quickly, the cartel rose up. About 300, eventually, this is according to a military guide, 700 to 800 cartel gunmen arose on the city against 350 soldiers. And the government said after a few hours, we're going to release him. And there was a huge, the president said he gave this. And so they released him. Now so you see, well, Mexicans are losing this fight against the cartels. However, this 1 year ago, in January 2023, the Mexican army went in there again and took Ovidio. And this time they went in there with 3,500 soldiers. This time they went in there with kind of more overwhelming force. Likely there were civilians killed in the town of Jesus Maria where they got him. But they went in there, and the cartel people rose up. They even fired on the airport, tried to fire on the plane, taking him away. But they did. So the Mexican soldiers generally, when they go in there with the power, when they go in there, Marines and so forth, can win those fights, but nothing is simply the scale. So this becomes where you have a cartel operatives can be in this area, and they can be out on the streets and controlling a town very openly. And the military go in there, there's a gunfight, and then there's a scandal. The military go in there, and then they just hide.
Yeah.
And then the military leaves, they come out again. So it's the
Yeah.
scale of this in so many places.
No, it's insurgency warfare. I mean, like I said, like this is nothing in this situation surprises guys like me in the U.S. military. 'Cause we dealt like this in probably more difficult situations, honestly, and talk about Afghanistan and obviously it didn't go out that well. But if you dedicate yourself to it, it can. But none of it works without a willing partner. You'd be amazed how much more advantage is derived from basic close air support. You don't need 3,000 Mexican Marines if you've got a few AC-130 gunships. Like it blows my mind, because I mean, my number one goal is to make Mexico a better place for Mexicans, because if Mexico's a better place for Mexicans, then America is safer. It's really that simple. It's our most important ally. And so the rhetoric from AMLO has been very discouraging along these lines. And I'm excited for him to be gone. And see if Claudia Sheinbaum's just a more practical person to work with. We've got to wrap up at this point. I'm sure we can keep talking forever, and hopefully maybe look forward to hearing from you, especially from some of the members that didn't get to hear from you in Mexico City. If you have any good contacts for us that we should talk to and learn more about the situation, that'd be great. But, thanks so much for being on, and thanks for coming up and addressing the task force like you did.
No problem. Yeah, and it's a very tragic situation right now, I think, on both sides of the border. Both in the United States, this level of overdoses is mind-boggling, and I can see why this should be a number one issue. And I think that the violence here in Mexico is also mind-boggling, and it's also a huge issue, I think, for Mexico and beyond. So I agree with both those things. I mean, I think it's just very tough to find out what the solutions are. I think it's good that, to try and bring these forward and try and talking to us journalists about these issues. But we hope we can find better ways that in 10, 20 years, there's not as many people dying of both overdose or bullets than there are right now.
Yeah, that's a good goal to have. All right. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Okay. Take care.